I suppose you're all aware that despite the very sterling lobbying efforts of Renovate Europe campaign, among others, we don't explicitly, within European legislation, have yet an objective for 80% renovation of existing buildings by 2050. But what we do have is a requirement for member states to make a long-term renovation strategy. They have to do that for the first time in 2014. I'm going to see whether I can work this wonderful device. Yeah. And then again, every 3 years they need to review that strategy. We see that as a very important tool in getting change in this sector. The thing about energy efficiency is that it requires nitty-gritty changes in households, in businesses, in finance sector, but also in government. And the act of making these strategies is a very helpful discipline and capacity building exercise for member states in looking at a longer time horizon than public policy making normally does. And the act, I think, is almost as important as the results, but the results will also be very interesting. A bit of background. So we're seeing an improving trend in the efficiency of buildings in Europe as far as space heating is concerned. But if you look at consumption overall, taking into account all the different forms of consumption in buildings, then I'm afraid the trend is less clear, and we see the residential curve going upwards, not as steeply as the services consumption or transport, but nevertheless we see that the gains that are being made in industry in terms of energy consumption are offset by increases in other sectors. So we're certainly not on the right path. And one of the reasons we're not on the right path is because renovation rates are low. It has to be said, and I'm glad that Oliver is going to be speaking because they're one of the institutions that is doing something about this problem, but one of the main problems we have in this area of work is that the data are quite insufficient for us to get a good understanding either of what the problem is or of where policies are going to tackle it. But the data that we have, much of it from BPIE, suggests that renovation rates are typically in the 1% to 1.5% per year range, which means that most of the buildings that are standing today, of course we know they'll still be standing in 2050, but most of them will be standing unrenovated in 2050, which is not going to achieve the aims that we're looking toward. Secondly, renovation depths are very low, and if we're going to achieve the kind of goals that we're setting, we need to move away from a situation in which most renovations, when they do take place, are minor, to one in which a much deeper approach to renovation is adopted. And therefore, indeed, we need a change. And these are some figures from the Commission's Energy Roadmap for 2050, showing if we get to, so the constraint that started this roadmap was to say we're going to achieve 80 to 95% reduction in CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in the EU by 2050, which is the goal that is set by heads of state and government. How do you get there? What are the credible paths to get there? And while there are some variations in the paths, there's very little variation in the degree to which we will depend on energy efficiency in order to achieve that goal along any credible route. And within energy efficiency, it's clear that there will be increases in demand for electricity in buildings, but we need to slow that down. And as far as heating and hot water is concerned, we need to continue some of the progress that is made and move to a really very rapid reduction. So if you hold that goal, that is to say the goal of of 80 to 95% decarbonisation by 2050, it's difficult not to hold the kind of goals that the campaign is working towards. I won't go on at length about this because Adrian always goes on at very eloquent length about it, but the benefits, of course, are such that even in our view, even if you didn't hold that goal, even if not only you didn't hold that goal, but you were climate skeptics, you would still be crazy not to be focusing on energy efficiency in buildings for economic reasons. That would be the case in any case, and all the more so given the crisis both of investment and of employment that we face at the moment. It simply makes sense to swap spending on oil and gas imports, to exchange that spending for spending on employing people to insulate our buildings and to install often European-produced clever devices which don't need much energy. It makes sense from an economic point of view. One thing that's missing from this slide, but I think is worth mentioning, is the increasing evidence that it makes sense from a building owner's point of view who simply cares about the value of their building. We had a study done for us by Biointelligence Services, which came out earlier in the year, came out in June, which showed that moving a building from, say, C class to B class, or B class to A class, increases the value of the building by 2 to 4%. A part of that increase is accounted for by the fact that it will cost less to heat the building, but that's not enough to explain the increase in value. So renovated buildings are better buildings, we know that, but the data that are coming through are giving the basis to go to building owners and say, why are you not making this investment, which makes sense for you in its own terms? So the benefits are clear. I mentioned the directive and it's Article 4. This is Article 4 of quite a few. And member states, I said that one of the virtues we see in the directive is capacity building in member states. I think it would be fair to say that we're forcing collectively quite a high level of effort on member states at the moment. But Article 4 is very much one of the key elements of the legislation. And the first reports are due in April 2014. We haven't had any yet, I'm not surprised, and so I can't tell you what's going to be in them. There is no particularly harmonised approach. As I said, these are things which are to be done every 3 years. So our thinking is, first time round, let's get some good practices developed, and then let's see whether member states would like to harmonise the approach in future. But we see these strategies as bringing together many of the key elements of both the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So the strategy for renovation of buildings in the long run will need to take into account the approach to the 3% renovation of central government buildings. It will need to take into account what member states plan to do on the rollout of smart meters. It will need to take into account the role that nearly zero energy buildings may play within that. It will need to take into account member states' strategies on financing and on the use of structural funds. It will need to take into account the development of cleverer ways to enable both public and private building owners to finance or to get support for their projects through energy performance contracting. And it'll need to take into account what member states are doing about the split incentives problem. So those are other elements of the jigsaw, and the renovation strategies are an opportunity to say, given that we're doing all of those different things, what does it all add up to? Does it add up to enough? Are there additional things that we need to do? We're expecting people to come with an ambitious strategy that covers the entire building stock. We're expecting them to come with an assessment of what the barriers are to achieving renovation of that stock. We'd like them to look at how that links with other policies. We'd like them to look at financing, and we very much see the public sector as being able to have a leading role, as member states like Germany have systematically demonstrated the power that that role can play. So that's a task for member states. I'd like to just finish up by saying a little bit about some of the tasks that we're working on. A key part of our work in the energy efficiency team at the European Commission at the moment is to support implementation by member states. I've mentioned already the Energy Efficiency Directive. I've mentioned already the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. I think it's important to mention the third strand of legislative work we do, which is eco-design and energy labelling. So there we are banning bad boilers, and we are ensuring that your heating system will have a label on it that labels the performance of the whole heating system. Those are very tough ways in which we underpin the move towards a better building stock. Same for lighting, same for ventilation, same for air conditioning. if those labels that go on those systems, if things are being labelled A and they're really C, then the credibility of this whole approach will fail. The support that we get from European business for that programme will fail because the European business are backing it because it enables them to make money by selling better products. And so a key role for member states alongside their work on the implementation of EUD and EPBD is to ensure proper market surveillance for our products legislation. As I said, we're also spending time monitoring the implementation of the relevant provisions of the legislation. One thing that I would mention there, you know that member states had to set their indicative targets for 2020 for energy efficiency. They're a great deal more ambitious taken together than they used to be. When we last asked the question what we were on track for by 2020, the answer was 9% savings. If you add up national targets, then in final energy terms, they're a bit more than 17%. In primary energy terms, they're a bit less than 17%. So member states are now have recognised the importance of energy efficiency, recognised the strengthening of the legislative framework, and are taking steps forward in what they're aiming at. It still has to be said that collectively those targets don't add up to the 20% that is the European aim. And one of the things that we're asked to do by June next year is to say, are we on track for the 20%? If not, what should be done about it? I think it's increasingly likely that that analysis will look beyond 2020 and will take into account the work that is going on at the Commission at the moment on 2030 objectives. So a part of our work is to look at the 2050 must set the framework for what we're doing, but it won't work if we say we have a goal for 2050 unless we look at the steps along the way. 2020 is a well-established step along the way, but we're also hoping to have the opportunity to look at how energy efficiency needs to work for the 2030 step. So we're quite busy. We're not as busy as we used to be, but and we're not as busy as I suspect we're likely to be under the new Commission, but we're still quite busy making sure that the legislative framework is properly implemented and that we work with stakeholders to look at what the next round of policy ought to look like. I'll mention one question and I'll stop. And Adrian's nodding, so I think that means, yes, Paul, mention one question and then stop. And that is, we don't yet properly understand the relationships between the different ways of ensuring that our buildings consume no fossil energy in 2050. We don't yet, I haven't seen yet any really convincing analysis that allows us to trade off passive buildings in the truest sense, that is to say buildings that don't need any outside sources of energy, versus on-building renewables, versus district heating coming from either biomass or from waste energy from industry, versus centralised, decarbonised electricity for devices like heat pumps. And we do need, in order to push this agenda forward, we need to have a sense of, for example, if district heating in places where it doesn't already exist is part of the solution, or if it isn't. If the goal for building renovation should be to achieve nearly zero levels in existing buildings, or if we should aim at a lower level, taking into account the contribution of off-building renewables. And any analysis that colleagues can do in that area will help us very much. But it's a lovely area of work, and thanks very much for listening.